and you can search the make, model, and serial number of, let's say, every firearm made by Smith & Wesson. And so you could then use that as a confiscation list to know which ones were the pistols with stabilizing braces. And when ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach testified before the Congress, he told the Senate Judiciary.
Welcome back to Freedom Forge. If you believe in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the God-given freedoms that built this country, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because today we're talking about a Senate hearing that every single American who values the Second Amendment needs to pay attention to. This hearing focused on allegations surrounding the ATF, Biden-era gun regulations, and what some lawmakers are calling a de facto national gun registry. Senators questioned witnesses about billions of firearm records allegedly being stored digitally by the federal government, and whether those records could eventually be used against law-abiding gun owners in America.
Very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here. Mr. Pratt, if I could just start with you. I want to ask you about something that I think deserves some answers. In fact, I've waited years for a substantive response on this. Back in 2021, I sent a letter to then President Biden's ATF asking about Rule 2021 R05, which is the rule that requires gun dealers to keep records on buyers permanently. They never gave me an answer. Thankfully, we now have a new administration, but it's often the case that old rules live on in a sort of zombie-like lifestyle through bureaucratic inertia. How many, do you know, Mr. Pratt, how many Biden-era ATF rules are still either on the books or continue to be enforced that we ought to be concerned about?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, there's several. With the one you just mentioned, the DOJ, even as of last week, was saying they intend to enforce the Biden rule. The same with the engaged in the business rule. Same with the pistol brace rule. We're fighting every single one of those. And, you know, I'm so glad you took an interest in the registry, because GOA actually FOIA'd the ATF manual, and you can search the make, model, and serial number of, let's say, every firearm made by Smith & Wesson. And so you could then use that as a confiscation list to know which ones were the pistols with stabilizing braces. And when ATF Director Stephen Dettelbach testified before the Congress, he told the Senate Judiciary Committee that they actually pay extra money to remove the search function on the names. And that was supposed to be our big defense against a confiscation list, our big defense against tyranny. They're paying extra money. What if they stop paying the extra money? Or what if they open up that Adobe document in some other type of document? They would still be able to search by name. So the only answer that we really have is to delete the registry.
Speaking of registries, my understanding is that sitting right now in a warehouse in West Virginia, and you described this in your testimony, is roughly 1 billion gun owner records, 94% of them that are already in digital format.
Yes.
Now, federal law is supposed to prohibit a national gun registry, but I'm wondering, what would you call that?
We call that a registry.
Looks like it to me, too. I mean, let's just walk through this. If a future administration that's hostile to Second Amendment rights in this country were to get its hands on those records, billion gun owners' names, other information contained there, what do you think it might be able to do with them?
Well, that's absolutely the problem, is with any gun ban that's passed, they're able to search the makes and models of those guns. And if they stop paying for the names attached to them, they know exactly who's not in compliance with the law, which, again, is something that already happened in New York City when they registered guns in the 60s, passed a ban in the 90s, and then they did spot checks on people that they believed were not complying with the law.
In 1967, correct? New York required registration of rifles,
That's
I think
right.
It was, and shotguns as well, and promised then that, it wouldn't be used for confiscation. But then, in fact, they were confiscated. I think they went door to door back in the late 60s.
Mayor David Dinkins signed the ban, and that's exactly what they did.
Then in 1991, New York City also banned another class of weapons, and officials used, as I understand it, an existing database to do the same thing, to force confiscation. There's also, I suppose, the example of our Australian friends in 1996, I think it was, Australia passed the National Firearms Agreement, they called it, which, as I understand it, restricted gun ownership and mandated the creation of a firearm registry. And then lo and behold, they went and used that to enforce mandatory buybacks. I seem to recall more than one Democratic candidate for president talking about mandatory buybacks. I mean, this is not a far-fetched conspiracy theory. This is something that's happened in our country. It's happened in our allies nations. And you've got members of the opposition party who are saying it's a great model. I mean, we should be concerned about this, shouldn't we?
We should be concerned about it, and that's why that registry cannot continue to exist, Senator.
What is the thing that we've got to do? What's the most urgent action we need to take, Mr. Pratt, to make sure this registry, A, isn't abused, and B, is eliminated so that it cannot be used for nefarious purposes, namely the violation of constitutional rights in the future?
Well, the No Registry Rights Act by Cloud in the House and Risch in the Senate would delete that registry. So if Congress would take that up and send it to the president, that would be fantastic.
I hope we'll do that post-haste. Thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I'll tell you right now, if even half of what was discussed in this hearing is true, Americans have every reason to be deeply concerned. Because once government starts compiling lists, histories, databases, and searchable records tied to constitutional rights, history tells us that power rarely stays limited forever. The hearing opened with questions about Biden-era ATF rules that are apparently still being enforced even after the administration changed. One senator pointed out that he had been asking for answers since 2021 about a rule requiring gun dealers to permanently keep buyer records. According to the testimony, there are still multiple firearm-related regulations from the previous administration actively hanging around through what he called bureaucratic inertia. And honestly, that phrase perfectly describes Washington. Rules get created, agencies expand power, temporary measures somehow become permanent, and the American people are expected to just accept it. What really caught my attention was the discussion about the ATF allegedly maintaining what witnesses described as roughly 1 billion gun owner records sitting in a warehouse in West Virginia, with most already in digital format. Think about that for a second. 1 billion records. Now defenders of big government always say, relax, it's not a registry. But here's the obvious question conservatives are asking. If the federal government can search, make, model, serial number, and eventually connect ownership information, what exactly is the practical difference? Because from where millions of Americans are sitting, it sure sounds like a registry. And this is where the conversation became explosive. The witnesses argued that while the ATF supposedly removed certain search functions connected to names, the information itself still exists digitally. One witness even claimed the agency pays extra money to disable certain search capabilities. That alone should alarm every American regardless of party. Because if a future administration decides to flip a switch, reinterpret the rules, or expand enforcement powers, all that data is already sitting there waiting. And let's stop pretending this concern comes from nowhere. The hearing brought up examples from New York City where firearm registration systems were later used to enforce confiscation efforts. They also referenced Australia's firearm buyback program after national registration systems were implemented there. Now, every time conservatives bring this up, the media instantly screams conspiracy theory. But it's not a conspiracy theory if it already happened. That's the key point. The senator even referenced past Democratic politicians openly discussing mandatory buybacks and aggressive firearm restrictions. So when gun owners hear that massive databases exist while politicians simultaneously talk about banning certain firearms, of course people are going to connect the dots. And honestly, they should. Because the Second Amendment was never written for hunting season. It was written because the founders understood something timeless. Governments can become abusive, power can become corrupt, and citizens must retain the ability to protect themselves and preserve liberty. That's why this issue matters so much. A lot of people watching mainstream coverage may think this is just another boring hearing about paperwork and regulations. It's not. This is about trust. Do Americans trust unelected federal agencies with massive amounts of personal firearm data? Do Americans trust future administrations not to abuse those records? Do Americans trust Washington to voluntarily limit its own power? Because history says skepticism is healthy. And what frustrates many conservatives is that there seems to be a completely different standard depending on which constitutional right we're talking about. Imagine if the federal government quietly built massive searchable databases tied to journalists, churches, political organizations, or voting histories. The media would lose its mind overnight. But when it involves firearms, suddenly some people act like concerns about government overreach are irrational. No, the Bill of Rights does not become optional depending on political trends. Another thing that stood out during this hearing was the repeated mention of stabilizing brace rules, engaged in the business rules, and expanding ATF interpretations. And this gets to a broader issue conservatives have been warning about for years. Unelected agencies are increasingly acting like lawmakers. Congress passes vague language. Agencies reinterpret it. Then millions of Americans suddenly become potential criminals because bureaucrats change definitions nobody voted on. That's dangerous, and it creates instability where ordinary citizens can no longer clearly understand what is legal from one administration to the next. One administration says something is fine. The next administration bans it. Then courts get involved. Then agencies reinterpret it again. That is not how constitutional rights are supposed to function. Rights are supposed to be protected consistently, not managed like temporary privileges handed out by federal agencies. What also struck me was how openly the witnesses discussed fear of future abuse. Some critics will say conservatives are exaggerating, but honestly, once information exists in digital form, the potential for misuse always exists. That's just reality. Governments evolve. Administrations change. Political climates shift. And power accumulated today can absolutely be weaponized tomorrow. That's why so many conservatives support efforts like the legislation mentioned during the hearing that would eliminate these records entirely. Because from a constitutional perspective, many Americans believe the safest registry is no registry at all. And let's talk about the deeper cultural divide here. There are millions of Americans who genuinely view firearm ownership as part of their identity, their independence, and their constitutional inheritance. They don't see guns as scary political talking points. They see them as symbols of self-reliance, family protection, and individual liberty. Meanwhile, many elites in Washington view firearm ownership primarily through the lens of regulation, restriction, and control. That disconnect keeps growing wider every year. And I think hearings like this expose just how serious that divide has become. The federal government may insist these systems are harmless, but Americans have learned over time that temporary powers often become permanent powers. Databases expand, rules evolve, enforcement grows, and constitutional boundaries slowly get pushed further and further. That's why people are paying attention to this hearing. Because underneath all the technical language and legal arguments is a very simple question. Should the federal government ever possess the practical ability to track firearm ownership on a massive scale? For many conservatives, the answer is absolutely not. Not because they're paranoid, not because they're extremists, but because they understand history. And because they understand that constitutional protections only survive when citizens are willing to defend them before it's too late. This hearing wasn't just about gun records. It was about trust in government, constitutional limits, and whether the Second Amendment remains a protected right or slowly becomes a regulated privilege. And honestly, I think millions of Americans watching this hearing saw exactly why the founders warned us about concentrated federal power in the first place. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Freedom Forge, and let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think Americans should be worried about these ATF records? Or do you believe the government can be trusted with that level of information? I want to hear what you think.